Mistakes Can Kill You by Louis L'Amour. Ma Redlin looked up from the stove. "Where's Sam? Is he still out yonder?" Johnny rubbed his palms on his chaps. "He ain't coming to supper, Ma. He done rode off." Pa and Elsie were watching him, and Johnny saw the hard lines of temper around Pa's mouth and eyes. Ma glanced at him apprehensively, but when Pa did not speak, she looked to her cooking. Johnny walked around the table and sat down across from Elsie. And when Pa reached for the coffee pot, he looked over at Johnny. "Was he alone, boy? Or did he ride off with that no-account Albie Bower?" Now, it was in Johnny neither to lie nor to carry tales, and reluctantly he replied, "He was with somebody. I reckon I couldn't be sure who it was." And Redlin snorted and put down his cup. It was a sore point with Joe Redlin that his son and only child should take up with the likes of Albie Bower. Back in Pennsylvania and Ohio, the Redlins had been good, God-fearing folk, while Bower was no good and came from a no-good outfit. Lately, he'd been flashing money around, but he claimed to have won it gambling at Degny's four-star saloon. "Once more I'll tell him," Redlin said harshly. "I'll have no son of mine traipsing around with that four-star outfit. Pack of thieves, that's what they are." And Ma looked up worriedly. She was a buxom woman with a round apple-cheeked face, and good humor was her normal manner. "Don't you be saying that away from home, Joe Redlin. That lost Degner's a gunslinger, and he'd like nothing so much as to shoot you after you taken Elsie from him." "I ain't afeard of him." Redlin's voice was flat. Johnny knew that what he said was true. Joe Redlin was not afraid of Degner, but he avoided him, for Redlin was a small rancher, a one-time farmer, and not a fighting man. And Lost Degner was bad all through and made no secret of it. His four-star was the hangout for all the tough element, and Degner had killed 2 men since Johnny had been in the country, as well as pistol-whipping a half-dozen more. It was not Johnny's place to comment, but secretly he knew the older Redlin was right. Once he had even gone so far as to warn Sam, but it only made the older boy angry. Sam was almost 21, and Johnny but 17. But Sam's family had protected him, and he'd lived always close to the competence of Paul Redlin. And John had been doing a man's work since he was 13, fighting a man's battles and making his own way in a hard world. And Johnny also knew what only Elsie seemed to guess, that it was Hazel, Degner's red-haired singer, who drew Sam Redlin to the four-star. It was rumored that she was Degner's woman, and Johnny had said as much to Sam. The younger Redlin had flown into a rage, and whirling on Johnny had drawn back his fist. And something in Johnny's eyes stopped him, and although Sam would never have admitted it, he was suddenly afraid. And like Elsie, Johnny had been adrift when he came to the Red Bar. Half dead with pneumonia, he'd come up to the door on his black gelding, and the Redlins' hospitality had given him a bed, the best care the frontier could provide. And when Johnny was well, he went to work to repay them. And then he stayed on for the spring roundup as a 40-a-month hand. And he volunteered no information, and they asked him no questions. He was slightly built and below medium height, but broad-shouldered and wiry. His shock of chestnut hair always needed cutting, and his green eyes had a lurking humor. He moved with deceptive slowness, for he was quick at work and skillful with his hands. And nor did he wait to be told about things, but even before he began riding, he had mended the buckboard, cleaned out and shored up the spring, repaired the door hinges, and cleaned all the guns. "We collect from Walters tomorrow," Redlin said suddenly, "and then I'm going to make a payment on that Sprague place and put Sam on it. With his own place, he'll straighten up and go to work." Johnny stared at his plate, his appetite gone. He knew what that meant, for it had been in Joe Redlin's mind that Sam should marry Elsie and settle on that place. Johnny looked up suddenly, and his throat tightened as he looked at her. The gray eyes caught his and searched them for an instant, and then moved away. And Johnny watched the lamplight in her ash-blonde hair, turning it to old gold. He pushed back from the table and excused himself, going out into the moonlit yard. He lived in a room he'd built in a corner of the barn. They had objected at first, wanting to stay at the house, but he couldn't bear being close to Elsie, and then he had that lonely man's feeling for seclusion. Actually, it had other advantages, for it kept him near his horse, and he never knew when he might want to ride on. That black gelding and his new .44 Winchester had been the only incongruous notes in his get-up when he arrived at the R-Bar, but he had hidden his guns and his best clothes in a cave up the mountain, riding down to the ranch in shabby range clothes with only the .44 Winchester for safety. He had watched the ranch for several hours despite his illness before venturing down to the door. It paid to be careful, and there were men about who might know him. And later, when securely in his own room, he had returned to his catch and dug out the guns and brought his outfit down to the ranch. Yet nobody had ever seen him with guns on, nor would they if he was lucky. The gelding turned its head and nickered at him, rolling his eyes at him, and Johnny walked into the stall and stood there, one hand on the horse's neck. "A little bit longer, boy, then we'll go. You sit tight now." There was another reason why he should leave now, for he'd learned from Sam that Flitch was in town. Now, Flitch had been on the Gila during the fight, and he'd been a friend of Cardwell's, whom Johnny had killed at the Pachaco. Moreover, Flitch had been in Cimarron a year before, when Johnny, only 15 then, had evened the score with the men who killed his father and stole their outfit. Johnny had gunned 2 of them down and put the 3rd in the hospital. Johnny was already on the range when Sam Redlin rode away the next morning to make his collection. Paul Redlin rode out with Elsie and found Johnny branding a yearling. Paul waved and rode on, but Elsie sat on her horse and watched him. "You're a good hand, Johnny," she said when he released the calf. "You should have your own outfit." "Oh, that's what I want most," he admitted. "But I reckon I'll never have it." "You can have it if you want it enough. Is it because of what's behind you?" He looked up quickly then. "What do you know of me?" "Nothing, Johnny, but what you've told us. But once when I started in the barn for eggs, you had your shirt off and I saw those bullet scars. Now, I know bullet scars because my own father had them. And you never told us anything, which usually means that there's something you ain't anxious to tell." "I guess you're right." He tightened the girth on his saddle. There ain't much to tell, though. I come west with my pa, and he was a lunger. I drove the wagon myself after we left Independence, clean to Caldwell, and then on to Santa Fe. We got us a little outfit with what Pa had left, and some mean fellows stole it off of us, and they killed Pa. Joe Redlin rode back to join them as Johnny was swinging to the saddle. He turned and glanced down at the valley. "Reckon that range won't get much use, Johnny," he said anxiously. "And the stock sure need it. Fair to middling grass, but too far from water." "That draw now," Johnny suggested. "I've been thinking about that draw. It'll take a sight of work. With a couple of good men and teams and some elbow grease, we could build them a dam across that draw. And there's a sight of water comes down when it rains, enough to last most of the summer if it was dammed, maybe even the whole year." Well, the 3 horses started walking toward the draw, and Johnny pointed out what he meant. "A feller over to Mobeetie did that one time," he said, "and it washed his dam out twice, but the 3rd time she held, and he had him a little lake all the year round." "That's a good idea, Johnny." Redlin studied the setup and then nodded. "A right good idea." "Sam and me could do it," Johnny suggested, avoiding Paul Redlin's eyes. Paul Redlin said nothing, but both Johnny and Elsie knew that Sam was not exactly ambitious about extra work. He was a good hand, Sam was, strong and capable, but he was big-headed about things and was a little inclined to sticking with a job. Reminds me, Paul said, glancing at the sun, Sam should be back soon. He might stop in town, Elsie suggested, and was immediately sorry she'd said it, for she could see the instant worry on Redland's face. The idea of Sam Redland stopping at the Four-Star with $7,000 on him was scarcely a pleasant one. Murder had been done there for much, much less. And then Sam was overconfident. He was even cocky. Well, I reckon I'd better ride in and meet him, Redland said, genuinely worried now. Sam's a good boy, but he sets too much store by himself. He figures he can take care of himself anywhere. But that pack of wolves... His voice trailed off to silence. Johnny turned in his saddle. "Well, I could just as well ride in, Paul," he said casually. "I ain't been to town for a spell, and if anything happened, I could lend a hand." Paul Redland was about to refuse when Elsie spoke up quickly. "Let him go, Paul. He could do some things for me, too, and Johnny's got a way with folks. Chances are he can get Sam back without trouble." "That's right." Johnny's thoughts were grim. "Send me along to save your boy. You don't care if I get shot, just so's he's been saved." "Well, all right, I'll go. And when I come back, I'll climb my gelding and light out up to Oregon. I've never been to Oregon." Flitch was in town, and his mouth tightened a little, but at that it would be better than Paul going. And Paul always said the wrong thing, being outspoken like. He was a man who spoke his mind, and to speak one's mind to Flitch or Lost Degner would mean a shooting. And it might be he could get Sam out of town all right. If he was drinking, it would be hard, especially if that redhead had her hands on him. "You reckon you can handle it?" Paul asked doubtfully. "Sure," Johnny said, his voice a shade hard. "I can handle it. I doubt if Sam's in any trouble. Later, maybe. All he'd need is somebody to side him." "Well," Paul was reluctant, "better take your Winchester, and my 6-gun, too. You hang on to it. I'll make out." Johnny turned the gelding and started back toward the ranch, his eyes cold. 17 he might be, but 4 years on the frontier on your own make pretty much of a man out of you. He didn't want any more shooting, but he had 6 men dead on his back trail now, not counting Comanches and Kiowas. 6, and he was 17. Next thing, they'd be comparing him to the kid, or to Wes Hardin. He wanted no gunfighter's name, only a little spread of his own where he could run a few cows and raise horses. Good stock, like some he'd seen in East Texas. No range ponies for him, but good blood. Now that's Sprague's place. But that was Sam's place, or as good as his. Well, why not? Sam was getting Elsie, and it was little enough he could do for Pa and Ma to bring Sam home safe. He left the gelding at the water trough and walked into the barn. In his room, he dug some saddle gear away from a corner out of a hiding place. In the corner, he took his guns. After a moment's thought, he took but one of them, leaving the .44 Russian behind. He didn't want to go parading into town with 2 guns on him, looking like a sure-enough shooter. And besides, with only 1 gun and the change in him, Flitch might not spot him at all. Johnny was at the gate riding out when Elsie and Paul rode up. Elsie looked at him, her eyes falling to the gun on his hip. Her face was pale and her eyes large. "Be careful, Johnny. I had to say that because you know how hot-headed Paul is. He'd get killed, and he might get Sam killed." That was true enough, but Johnny was aggrieved. He looked her in the eye. "Sure, that's true. But you didn't think of Sam, now did you? You were just thinking of Paul." Her lips parted to protest, and then her face seemed to stiffen. "No, Johnny, it wasn't only Paul I thought of. I did think of Sam. Why shouldn't I?" That was plain enough. Why shouldn't she? Wasn't she going to marry him? Wasn't Sam getting the Sprague place when they got that money back safe? He touched his horse lightly with a spur and moved on past her. All right, he'd send Sam back to her if he could. It was time he was moving on anyway. The gelding liked the feel of the trail and moved out fast. 10 miles was all, and he could do that easy enough, and so he did it. And Johnny turned the black horse into the street and stopped before the livery stable, swinging down. Sam's horse was tied at the Four-Star's hitch rail, and the saddlebags were gone. Johnny studied the street and then crossed it and walked down along the buildings on the same side as the Four-Star. He turned quickly into the door. Sam Redland was sitting at a table with the redhead. the saddlebags on the table before him, and he was drunk. He was very drunk. And Johnny's eyes swept the room, the bartender and Lost Degner standing together, talking. And none of them paid any attention to Johnny, for neither knew him, but Flitch did. And Flitch was standing down the bar with Albie Bauer, but none of the old Gila River outfit. Both of them looked up, and Flitch kept looking, never taking his eyes from Johnny. Something bothered him. Maybe it was the one gun. Johnny moved over to Sam's table. They had to get out of here fast before Flitch remembered. "Hi, Sam," he said. "Just happened to be in town, and Pa said if I saw you, decide you on the way home." Sam stared at him sullenly. "Side me? You?" He snorted his contempt. "I need no man to side me. You can tell Paul I'll be home later tonight." He glanced at the redhead. "Much later." "Want I should carry this stuff home for you?" Johnny put his hand on the saddlebags. "Leave him be," Hazel protested angrily. "Can't you see he don't want to be bothered? He's capable of taking care of himself, and he don't need no kid for guardeen." "Beat it," Sam said. "You go on home. I'll come along later." "You better come now, Sam." Johnny was getting worried, for Lost Degner had started for the table. "Here, you!" Degner was sharp. "Leave that man alone. He's a friend of mine, and I'll have no saddle tramp annoying my customers." Johnny turned on him. "I'm no saddle tramp. I ride for his pa. He asked me to ride home with him now, and that's what I aim to do." As he spoke, he was not thinking of Degner, but of Flitch. The gunman was behind him now, and neither Flitch, fast as he was, nor Albie Bauer were above shooting a man in the back. "I said to beat it." Sam stared at him drunkenly. "Saddle tramp's what you are. Folks never should have took you in." "That's it," Degner said. "Now get out. He don't want you nor your company." There was a movement behind him, and he heard Flitch say, "Lost, let me have him. I know this hombre. This that kid gunfighter, Johnny O'Day from the Gila." Johnny turned slowly, his green eyes flat and cold. "Hello, Flitch. I heard you was around." Carefully he moved away from the table, aware of the startled look on Hazel's face, the suddenly tight awareness on the face of Lost Degner. "Are you looking for me, Flitch?" It was a chance he had to take, his best chance now. If shooting started, he might grab the saddlebags and break for the door, and then the ranch. And they would be through with Sam Redlin once the money was gone. "Yeah," Flint stared at him, his unshaven face hard with the lines of evil and shadowed by the intent that rode him hard. "I'm looking for you. Always figured you got off easy. Made you a fast rep gunning down your betters." Bauer had moved up beside him, but Lost Degner had drawn back to one side. Johnny's eyes never left Flitch. "Are you in this, Lost?" Degner shrugged. "Why should I be? I was no Gila River gunman. This is your quarrel. Finish it between you." "All right, Flitch," Johnny said. "You want it. I'm giving you your chance to start the play." The stillness of a hot mid-afternoon lay on the Four-Star. A fly buzzed against the dusty, cobwebbed back window, and somewhere in the street a horse stamped restlessly, and a distant pump creaked. Flitch stared at him, his little eyes hard and bright. His sweat-stained shirt was torn at the shoulder, and there was dust ingrained in the pores of his face. His hands dropped in a flashy draw, but he had only cleared leather when Johnny's first bullet hit him, puncturing the Bull Durham tag that hung from his shirt pocket. The second shot cut the edge of it, and the third, fourth, and fifth slammed Albie Bauer back, knocking him back step by step. But Albie's gun was hammering, and it took the sixth shot to put him down. Johnny stood over them, staring down at their bodies, and then he turned to face Lost Degner. Degner was smiling, and he held a gun in his hand from which a thin tendril of smoke lifted. Startled, Johnny's eyes flickered to Sam Redlin. Sam lay across the saddlebags, blood trickling from the temples. He had been shot through the head by Degner, under cover of the gun battle, murdered without a chance. Johnny O'Day's eyes lifted to Lost Degner. The saloon keeper was still smiling. Yes, he's dead, and I've killed him. He had it coming, the fool, thinking we cared to listen to his bragging. All we wanted was that money, and now we got it. Me, Hazel, and I. We've got it. Not yet. Johnny's lips were stiff, and his heart was cold. He was thinking of Pa and Ma and Elsie. I'm still here. You, Degner laughed. With an empty gun? I counted your shots, boy. Even Johnny O'Day is cold turkey with an empty gun. 6 shots, 2 for Flitch, and beautiful shooting, too. But for 4 shots for Albee, who was moving and shooting and not so easy a target. But now I've got you. And with you dead, I'll just say Sam came here without any money and that he got shot during the fight. Sound good to you? Johnny still faced him, his gun in his hand. Not bad, he said. But you still have me here, Loss, and this gun ain't empty. Degner's face tightened and then relaxed. Not empty? I counted the shots, kid, so don't try bluffing me. Now I'm killing you. He tilted his gun toward Johnny O'Day, and Johnny fired. Once, twice, a third time. As each bullet hit him, Lost Degner jerked and twisted. But the shock of the wounds, and death wounds they were, was nothing to the shock of bullets from that empty gun. He sagged against the bar and then slipped forward. Johnny moved in on him. You can hear me, Loss? The killer's eyes lifted to his. This ain't a 6-shooter. It's a Walsh 12-shot Navy gun, 36 caliber. She's right handy, Loss, and it only goes to show you shouldn't jump to conclusions. Hazel sat at the table, staring at the dying Degner. You better go to him, Red, Johnny said quietly. He's only got a minute. And she stared at him as he picked up the saddlebags and backed to the door. And Russell, the storekeeper, was on the steps with a half-dozen others, none of whom he knew. Degner killed Sam Redlin, he said. Take care of Sam, will you? At Russell's nod, Johnny swung to the saddle and turned the gelding toward home. He wouldn't leave now. Couldn't leave now. They'd all be alone there without Sam. And besides, Pa was going to need help on that dam. Boy, he touched the gelding's neck, I reckon we got to stick around for a while. This is Willie Nelson. We hope you enjoyed this presentation of Willie Nelson, My Favorite Louis L'Amour Stories. This series was produced by Lana Nelson and Wiley Stateman and directed by Lon Bender of Sound Deluxe Audio Publishing.
This performance is a production of Sound Deluxe Audio Publishing Incorporated. Copyright 1995, all rights reserved.